You know, I've been speaking to certain media outlets over the last 24 hours, and at one point I said I thought this election was actually kind of boring because none of the candidates were especially terrifying or polarizing.
大家好，我是蔡斐，
我是路易莎莎，
欢迎收看《匪夷所思》。好，那今天这个阿姨想知道啊，我们还是要 recap 我们这个选举的结果啦啊，
请一个外国人来。
这一次呢，我们请到的是美国学者祈凯立，这个祈凯立的简历还是交给你大家再复习一下好了。
好的，祈凯立是这个美国少见的这个研究台湾的台湾专家。那他的研究包含台湾政治的这个转型，包含台湾的政党政治。那他目前是在这个史丹佛大学的这个胡佛研究所担任这个研究员，然后同时也在史丹佛大学有教课。大家如果有搜寻他的名字 Caris Templeman 的话呢，会发现他的个人简历、个人网站上面还有 blog， 他到现在都还每个月非常认真写关于台湾选举的观察哦。大家有空的话可以去看看。
特别强调一点哦，这个祈凯立其实是非常少数的美国的美中台专家里面的台湾专家，OK， 这个很多美国的所谓的美中台专家，其实都是中国专家，
包牌啦，包牌一定是包牌。
对，可是祈凯立是真的很早就开始研究台湾，
对
啊，所以他对于台湾的这个关注啊，是我觉得他是了解真的非常的深啦。那另外一方面也是因为他在选前嘛，我们已经请他来就是聊过一次啊。那这一次我就想，那选完啦，那就来看看他以前讲的对不对啊？
对啊，你就是来找人家打脸的吧？
对。因为他讲错很多地方
不要这样子，这样人家没有对，但我们这一次真的是就是祈凯立人也非常好嘛，因为我们其实有跟他说这个问他选后愿不愿意来，那他说这个其实他很快就要飞了，但他愿意，因为上次谈的也蛮开心的，他特别排了一个时间，然后虽然那天跑了非常多行程，看起来很累，但他还是接受我们的访问，这点我们是非常感谢的。
对，先插播一下哦，那我们之前不是已经请了小周来了吗？然后这一次我们请的是美国学者嘛，然后接下来我们还会请2位住在中国以外的 YouTuber
海外华人
这样子，他们也来台湾观选嘛也看看台湾的他们对于这次台湾观选的一些想法这样子。那回到祈凯立那我们就想要问他几个问题啦。那第一个就是其实这一次外媒的这个报道里面其实有一点我看了其实蛮不舒服的，因为他就是会把我们的候选人2分法选谁的话就是好像是战争选谁的话就是和平还有人把它形成是什么民主与专制的对决我其实觉得这个2分法很不好，但是我很希望从祈凯立他从他的角度来看一个美国学者的角度来看，他觉得这外媒为什么会这样做？那另外一个呢，我很想要知道的是，就是要谈一谈就是对于年底美国总统也要大选了，那川普现在目前看起来很可能会回笼，那我很想要知道说，如果川普正在回来的话，配上赖清德这样一个结果，这样一个组合，对于美中台关系会产生什么样的影响
？OK， 好，那既然我们就是讲 review 嘛，我们就来 review 一下当初这个祈凯立的预言。他预言做2件事情，第一个是侯友宜会成为这个非常强的国民党的候选人，那第2件事情就是柯文哲
就没中这一点就没中
可是他很成功的2022年就预言就是侯友宜会代表国民党当选，我觉得这蛮厉害的。
对可是他没有选得很好。
所以我们就来问他为什么侯友宜
他觉得怎么样？
他评估怎么样？为什么侯友宜会选得没有这么好？那第2件事就是我们那时候还讲到了嘛，台湾的这个政党政治这个非常他说僵固的政党体制，那也就是蓝绿2大党啦。那所以他那个时候预言是柯文哲会被弃保，那不过很明显的柯文哲逃脱了这个命运。那想问问看他，
而且人家这次选的比预期好很多
大概就多个对啦，
对比预期选的好很多
对，那我们这次来看，
我觉得他就打脸了嘛。
不要这样子，人家就是来做客的，我们就来，既然是学者嘛，预言总是有出错的时间，那我们就来看看他怎么样解读这样的一个结果。那同时包含这个他也讲到了嘛，台湾的这个大选区制度其实不利小党，那民众党现在好不容易斩获到8席了，民众党作为一个第3势力，他不是第一个选的这么好的第3势力，但是要怎么样维持下去可能会是一个困难。那我想看他的看法跟小周有没有不一样。
对，也要特别提醒大家这祈凯立是美国的学者，他虽然对台湾有很深的研究，但他是美国学者，他不代表美国官方的说法。OK， 好，这2个大家要分清楚，这样子。OK， 好。那么在这个听祈凯立怎么讲之前，我们先来听听我们的干爹吧。大家好，我是蔡斐，
我是敲边鼓。
OK， 好，那上一次我们是开团卖锅子嘛，这一次我们要卖吸尘器。
但阿姨，
这个吸尘器对哈，这样
你没有在打扫，你为什么要买吸尘器干嘛？
我拿来骑当扫把骑可以吗？伊莱克斯 Well Q7，OK，我告诉你最好的吸尘器是什么？就是我买来以后有旁边的人会做，
就是我。
对，怎样做？你用起来觉得怎么样嘛？
我觉得它其实最好用的地方就是它很轻，很重的话会影响转向。然后呢，还有它最方便的就是像我们办公室的地板。颜色很淡，所以你一有头发很明显。这台 Well Q7 它有一个很棒的科技，就是自动毛发截断科技，就是你看这边，这边你一踩，然后你的头发就可以断了，你就不会整圈卡在前面。
I see，它自己帮你剪断了。
对，它帮你剪断，不然其实一般的吸尘器你要用手去把它挖出来，超恶心。
对呀，它这个一支要多少钱呢？
一支我们之前买是6888。
哇，这现在吸尘器怎么都这么便宜？是这样吗？现在
而且你开团，你猜你多少钱？
我不知道多少钱，我们开
变成5888，它还送专用滤网，然后呢，你满5000块还会送388的 PB， 超划算。
哇，真的很划算，你送好多东西哦。那大家如果有需要这个吸尘器的话啊，记得看资讯栏哦，买给别人用也可以哦，不用自己吸哦。好，那接下来我们回正片吧。OK, Kairos.First of all, say hi to our audience.
大家好，我是祈凱立。
Okay, so Kairos, where were you yesterday?
I was observing the election.
But with whom and then where?
I was observing the election with some local people in Banqiao-shi.
Oh, okay. Why the choice of location in Banqiao-shi?
Because Banqiao is very competitive. There was a really interesting legislative district there. Luo Zhizheng is the incumbent, and I wanted to see how Luo Zhizheng was going to do in that legislative race. So I picked a precinct in Banqiao that has been very closely contested the last few elections and has actually switched between blue and green. And I wanted to get a sense of, when the early vote was counted, who was likely to pull that election out. And when I left the poll, I was there about an hour watching the count. And Luo Zhizheng was just neck and neck with, what was his name? Ye Yuanzhi, right? So I was like, Luo Zhizheng is not going to get blown out, but it's going to be close. In the end, it looks like he lost by 2,000 votes.
Right.
So
it was very close.
It was very close. The other reason I wanted to do that is because there's lots of foreign delegations who come into Taiwan and want to observe the elections, and they usually go to the Zhongshen Hui, the election center, but that's not really representative of Taiwan as a whole or even of the greater Taipei area. And there's lots of foreign media there. And so I wanted to get away from that.
So you want to get the
I wanted to get the
local
feel
of
right, the kind of local feel for what it was like to experience the election as an ordinary Taiwanese.
So and this time I think they have so many like foreign media like journalists come to Taiwan.
Huge number, more than I've ever seen before.
A lot more, and then the reports. There are so many reports about this election too. I have to say that this happened like like Ukraine is still fighting, Gaza is still fighting, and the Red Sea is having a lot of problems right now. And then but the world turned attention to Taiwan right now. Do they really think us as a next flashpoint?
Some people do. Yeah, I've heard that, today Ukraine, tomorrow Taiwan, or, what the U.S. and Europe do in Ukraine will affect Taiwan's own security. I'm skeptical of arguments that they're directly linked. I think, first and foremost, China as a potential adversary is a very different beast than Russia or Hamas or the Houthis in Yemen. Those are all just fundamentally different adversaries and conflicts. The salience of that threat, I think, has risen in the American foreign policy mindset because of the actual specter of war in Europe, right? The fighting in Ukraine really has driven home how devastating a hot conflict in East Asia would be. And, the three cases you mentioned, all of those hot conflicts now, you could have predicted, or you could have at least, if you were forced to predict, say, 15 years ago, where you might see conflict in the world, those three spots were obvious places to look, right? And so another kind of leftover piece of the Cold War is the Taiwan PRC relationship, right? There's a fundamental incompatibility between what the people of Taiwan want for their future and what the PRC wants for their future. And the PRC is growing in capabilities, power, and perhaps growing more impatient about the cross-strait situation. And so from an American perspective, looking around the world at the next 15 years, what are the geopolitical points of tension that could erupt into a hot conflict? Taiwan is always near the top of the list. Yeah.
So, but talking about our result, okay, you know, the choice of lie at the end,
Yeah.
okay, a lot of Western media would describe it as like a choice between peace and war. I think this is according to Chinese. And then a lot of Western media would say that this is a choice between democracy and authoritarianism. So, but what's your take on this?
In terms of war and peace, I mean, that's the framing that Beijing wanted people to use. And then if you don't want war, which nobody does, the peace candidate is the candidate that Beijing likes, right? So I don't think that narrative was entirely correct either. Lai Ching-te is committed. He's said he's committed to maintaining the status quo. So unless you think Tsai Ing-wen was the war candidate, Lai Ching-te is not the war candidate either. And then Hou Youyi also, as the candidate that Beijing, or at least from the party that Beijing likes more, is also was committed very, I think, credibly to raising defense spending, to continuing defense reforms. And when he went to the United States, he convinced the American side that he would take national security issues quite seriously, and that he was a different kind of KMT candidate than Ma Ying-jeou or Han Kuo-yu.
So we're saying that, you know, actually all these three candidates are, can we say that the foreign policy aren't that different?
Yeah, actually, that was one of my big takeaways from actually being here during this election cycle was the three candidates were all kind of arguing over very, very narrow differences. And the contrast with the way outside media portrayed this election and the way that people generally talk about this election in the U.S. Was really stark. You know, the kind of rhetoric around this election in the U.S. is this is a crucial choice. It could set the direction of Taiwan's, you know, it could set Taiwan's future for the next 25 years or forever. Or
do you think it's exaggerated?
I think that's absolutely an exaggeration. Absolutely. I think all three candidates, this was, to borrow some political science jargon, this was a maintaining election. The ruling party, the DPP has been more popular than the KMT generally over the last two election cycles, and they were a little bit more popular this cycle as well. And so voters, you know, the plurality of voters elected to stick with what they know. And the offers that the other candidates were presenting weren't really a significant departure from what Tsai Ing-wen has done over the last 8 years. So I've been speaking to certain media outlets over the last 24 hours, and at one point I said I thought this election was actually kind of boring because none of the candidates were especially terrifying or polarizing. Unlike 2020, when Han Kuo-yu was very polarizing, you either loved him or you hated him, and there wasn't a whole lot in between. Or in 2016, when it felt like this was a critical choice, whether you wanted to continue down the route that Ma Ying-jeou had taken Taiwan or whether you wanted to reject that and vote for something else. This time around, none of the candidates really presented that sort of dramatic departure from the current situation or were a really polarizing candidate. And then on the other side, none of them was especially inspiring either, right? Tsai Ing-wen in some ways really kind of carved out a unique image and place for herself in Taiwan politics. Ma Ying-jeou actually had a lot of charisma when he ran in 2008. Chen Shui-bian, when he won in 2000, was really kind of electrifying for a lot of DPP supporters.
But I think a lot of people are asking, you know, is that the choice of Lai as our president does it really increase the tension between China and Taiwan?
Well, that's what the majority of American observers think. And so I know some people in the U.S. Were quietly hoping that the KMT would win this because at least Beijing will talk to the KMT, and it would be beneficial for the United States if Beijing would cooperate or communicate at least with the Taiwan side, and it would be beneficial for U.S.-China relations to have Taiwan kind of moved out of the center so that our two sides can talk about all of the other challenges in the relationship.
When you talk about some people, are we talking about some people in the Biden administration?
Could be Biden administration. Certainly there are people who hold those views. I think outside the Biden administration, I think even in the defense and security sector, there are different views on this. But, you know, it's no secret that Beijing would try to make the KMT look good, I think, initially, at least initially, if they had won this election. And that would probably mean, you know, not imposing economic sanctions, probably pulling back some of the military exercises they've conducted around Taiwan, and maybe even opening up a little international space for Taiwan that they've constricted over the last 8 years. I think with the election of Lai, all of those concessions are unrealistic now.
So we are going to have Lai as our president. So how bad do you think that China's pressure going to be? Do you think they really is going to ramp up?
Well, they can do more, certainly. They have a lot of ammunition in their, well, let me use a different metaphor. They've got a lot of tools in their toolkit of coercion that they can come after Taiwan with. The obvious thing that they've telegraphed for at least 6 months is ECFA, and so Fu Mao, and the tariff-free imports that Taiwan is allowed into the PRC. They will probably impose strategically and kind of almost seemingly at random, you know, a ban or a tariff on goods that have a lot of high symbolic value that target particular political constituencies in Taiwan, but that don't have really that much importance to the overall trade relationship, and certainly not to China's own industrial interests. So you would expect to see tariffs on pineapples, right? We've seen that, or other agricultural goods, because everybody in Taiwan can understand what a pineapple is, and that it's grown here, and it has this kind of symbolic power as, you know, Taiwanese produced this beautiful thing, and whereas semiconductor chip, number one, it's kind of hard to understand exactly, you know, if it's 2 millimeters across or 2 nanometers across, nobody can see it. It's hard to understand exactly how that plays into the broader supply chain of and where it ends up in a final product. And China really needs those chips. And so they're not going to impose economic sanctions against products that are really critical to China's own national security interests.
Okay, but it doesn't sound anything new, though. We have been dealing with others already.
Right, exactly. And so this is kind of a maintenance or a continuation, let's say, of the last 8 years. And Beijing is, I think they're out of ideas about how to deal with Taiwan. If the Taiwan voters keep voting for the wrong choice, they've tried coercion. They've tried, they've had this dual track policy where on one hand, they put pressure on the Taidu Funza, in their words, but then they reach out and try to engage with the Fei Taidu Funza, right? So the dual track strategy is still basically what they've got, and they just they appear to be telegraphing that they will amp up the coercive part a little more. And I don't know if they will double down on the engagement part. And here's where the current makeup of the legislature, the incoming legislature, is really interesting, because Beijing can read the presidential and legislative election results as the majority of the public rejecting the DPP, right? And so if they're willing to be a little bit elastic in how they interpret.
Do you think it's possible?
I think they could engage with the TPP, certainly. Ko Wen-je has sometimes said words that they like, what is it? 两岸一家亲, right? So he could repeat that again. Of course, he says all kinds of stuff they don't like too. So it depends on what you get from Ko Wen-je that day. But I think they do have an incentive to try to reach out to the TPP as well as the KMT and engage with them. So they'll try to isolate the DPP and paint them as much as possible as hopeless Taiwan independence dead enders or whatever.
So is the I think in the after the election result, the 国台办 actually say something like the usual stuff like 九二共识啦、两岸统一啦 but they also had say something like 将与有关政党团体促进两岸交流合作，推动两岸关系和平发展。So you think this is talking about like this, like a dialogue with TPP or
and that's not new, right? That's been their policy since Tsai Ing-wen took office. Talk to the KMT and talk to all the people who aren't green, to be a little looser with terms, but shut out anybody who is clearly DPP or on that side of the spectrum, with the idea that Taiwanese voters, placing their hopes on the Taiwanese people, Taiwanese voters will see that playing nice with Beijing provides benefits in the long run.
I talked to all three camps. They all told me that China is a threat. So I don't see anybody can back up from this consensus, no matter how friendly you're going to be with China.
Right. And so I think that strategy has failed over the last 8 years, Beijing's two-track strategy. And in the current moment, I mean, what I think they will do is double down on it, right? But I don't think it has much chance of working the way they want it to work, at least.
Okay. Then let's talk about Ko Wen-je. Okay. Last time we talked, you seem to think that that like the two-party system is like a very strong structure in Taiwan's politics. At that time, I think you think TPP will be marginalized. But the result doesn't seem like it. So what do you think about that?
Right. So I had expected that Ko Wen-je would eventually fall quite a bit in the polls and that it would turn into basically a two-candidate race towards the end. And that was based on two assumptions. The first assumption was that the majority of Taiwanese this election cycle want somebody besides the DPP, and they're willing to vote against the DPP to get them out. And I think that assumption was correct, right? Lai Ching-te only won 40%. But the second assumption was that the people who wanted to get the DPP out, and so they will vote for whichever candidate looks further ahead in the polls. Yeah, and I think the part of that assumption that was wrong is that a lot of people didn't see defeating Lai as the paramount goal here. They actually saw rejecting both parties as more important than beating Lai and bringing somebody else in. So they were at best indifferent between Lai and Ho, and perhaps preferred Ke simply because he was different. He was, clearly, in this case, clearly not green or blue. To Ke's credit, he managed to transform himself from basically a DPP candidate when he first ran for Taipei mayor to a kind of light blue candidate when he was flirting with the KMT to do a joint ticket. And then in the end, neither. And so that's where he sits today. I will say the legislature is a very different story, right? The TPP did quite well in the party list relative to last time, but they didn't win any local seats, right?
What does that mean to you?
Well, that's when I say there's an institutionalized party system and there's structural advantages for the big parties, that's really where you see it. You have to develop some real local grassroots talent if you want to win in most of the district races. And the TPP is not a big party. It's new. It doesn't have a whole lot of presence around most of Taiwan. And so it's a lot harder to win a lot of seats if they're elected in part based on the quality of local candidates rather than just one candidate at the top on the presidential ticket.
So in the coming 4 years, do you expect TPP would really play a critical third-party power in this, like traditional green, blue, balanced power?
Yeah, well, they've got the critical votes in the legislature, right? This was, I think, Ke's plan all along was to make sure that they were able to deny either the DPP or the KMT a majority in the legislature. That's a good place to be if you're a small party, at least now. The challenge is, if you're trying to build up a new party like this, you have some difficult trade-offs between office, policy, and votes going forward. And so right now they've won their seats. They could potentially extract some policy concessions. Ko Wen-je could make a play to have Lai Ching-te appoint a TPP member to his cabinet, maybe multiple TPP members, maybe Ke himself. But the problem with that in the long term is then you are part of the DPP government, and everything that goes wrong in that government, especially if it's in your ministry, reflects negatively on your own party, right? And so the TPP's brand gets diluted a little bit. It's hard to tell if they've joined up with the DPP, well, what's the difference if I have to vote for one or the other next time?
I think they'd rather work with the KMT.
Well, I think it'll vary by issue. I mean, if it's a security issue and, they need to pass a special budget to buy arms from the U.S., I suspect the TPP is going to be a more willing partner with the DPP on that than the KMT will be. On other issues, they might, for instance, energy, both the KMT and the TPP have come out in favor of extending the life of Taiwan's nuclear plants. And there you might actually see them vote to override the attempt to close nuclear power plants. I think if the TPP is smart, they will play this issue by issue. I think where they get in trouble in the future is if they join with the KMT on every issue and just become the 反对党, right? The opposition party that just 反对, right? And so then voters are going to look at them and say, well, how are they any different from the KMT? They always say no. They always want the DPP to fail. And their whole brand right now, to the extent they have one, is that they are pragmatic and they approach questions without prior ideology or partisanship and just try to solve problems. And so if they become known as the no caucus, if they're constantly voting no, they destroy that brand.
Do you think they are capable of doing that?
That's an excellent question. I think we don't know. The people in the legislature are mostly new to the party. Huang Guochang is a very new TPP member. Huang Shanshan is she's a strong personality. So is Huang Guochang. So is Ke Wen-je. But Ke, unlike the other two, doesn't actually have a position now. He's a private citizen as of today, right? And so he may be party leader, but he may struggle to control what the TPP party caucus does. And there may be differences of opinion within that party caucus. And so they will need to build a stronger set of institutions within the party that can commit everybody to a common vision and kind of set of rules to govern the inevitable conflicts that will arise. And so that if the TPP wants to survive long-term, I think they should study the DPP's track record. So the DPP is the first kind of opposition party to grow up, and they faced all of these problems as well. The Dong Wai was full of a bunch of, a lot of people who were pretty radical, very committed to ideology, often vehemently disagreed on things. And the DPP actually had to build a party structure that would allow that conflict to take place, but keep it inside the party and keep them all from splitting the party. And they did that very successfully, and that's why they're the ruling party today.
Exactly.
So the TPP needs to live up to that legacy, I think.
Yeah, 我们都说的民进党就是每一次内斗很厉害是没有错，一选举 许就团
都会
结对外
团结，
对，
对
就团结
团结出来
对外。但是现在看看民众党这一票，我不知道。
Yeah.
What do you think then?
Well,
do
the
you
other
think
issue
they are
is-
capable of doing that?
Well, the other issue
Contend-
is voters, right? So the voters who voted for Kopi this time around, to the extent we know, appear to have voted mostly to reject green and blue. There's certainly some people who were really inspired by Ko Wen-je and his track record as Taipei mayor and his rhetoric. But my sense is that a lot of people who voted for him were mostly saw him as a clear alternative to the other parties. And if, somebody else shows up next election cycle offering that, but without, say, some of the more politically incorrect comments and some of the other baggage that comes with Ko Wen-je, well, maybe all of them will move over to that other candidate. And so what I'm arguing here is there's no kind of deep party loyalty to the TPP in the way that there is to the DPP among some voters and to the KMT among some voters. I don't know what the TPP's core values are. I don't know what their 核心价值 are going to be going forward that would make people say, TPP stands for me. This is who I am, right? Right now, it just stands for being kind of aquamarine in the middle of green and blue and a rejection of green-blue politics. But there's not a real kind of positive vision for what the TPP will provide to people going forward.
A lot of people, young people believe that Ko Wen-je represents hope.
Yeah, sure.
This is exact words they told me. He said that he gave us hope.
Right. I heard that term hope thrown around in other contexts. So 2020, talking to blue voters, Han Kuo-yu gave them hope and hope that the Zhonghua Minguo would survive if Han Kuo-yu were the candidate and were elected, right? And so there's a very clear vision associated with that hope. They supported, the ROC and what it stood for. And then thinking back to my own country's context, hope under Obama, that was a huge part of his image as a candidate there. And hope meant kind of a rejection of the George W. Bush era politics, both in foreign policy and domestic economic management. And so the appeal came along with a clear set of policy goals. And Obama, to his credit, I think tried to push those forward. They did reform the financial regulators. They expanded health insurance. They passed a big infrastructure bill. And so there were very kind of clearly defined things that came along with that message. I'm not sure what comes along with Ko Wen-je's message of hope other than I'm not green and not blue.
Okay, I want to talk about KMT too. So, how do you think they performed this time? How do you evaluate that? Do you think they ran a successful campaign this time?
I think their campaign really underperformed. So I think it was not very successful. And I'm still a bit puzzled by why they struggled so much. So one puzzle is Ho Yo-yi looked like he was going to be the candidate a year ago at this time. And he had plenty of time to prepare to be the candidate. He was probably the best candidate on paper that the party could have nominated. And so it shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone when Eric Ju came out and announced that he had, in fact, picked Ho Yo-yi as the nominee. And then Ho Yo-yi's polling numbers went way down very quickly. And it set off this sense of panic within the KMT because they weren't unified. They thought Ho was a really great candidate because his numbers as Taipei mayor were really high. And then to see them collapse, they just didn't understand what was driving that. And Ho himself, to be frank, I think was pretty underprepared for the campaign. He started talking about issues that were obviously going to be in the campaign, like conscription, for instance. The return to 1 year of conscription is a controversial issue in Taiwan. The DPP had pushed it through. And The KMT leadership under Eric Chu had tried to position the party to appear to be supportive of that reform, in part to satisfy or to reassure the American side that this was a cross-party consensus. And then Ho, in the first few days after he was nominated, suggested that maybe we should move back to 4 months. And then it kind of had to walk that back, right? It's like, I was just puzzled why that issue, they didn't have a clear kind of campaign platform worked out by the time Ho Yo-yi became the nominee. So that I thought was kind of a misstep. And overall, it just felt like Ho was running, like he started the race 20 meters behind everybody else in the race.
So you think that's Ho's fault or is the party's fault?
Well, I think it's probably a bit of both. And it was never clear to me ultimately who was in charge of the campaign. Eric Chu was kind of the dominant figure in the party early on, and kept putting himself out front and center in conversations about what the party was going to do and then the criticisms they were going to make of the government. But Ho Yo-yi is the actual candidate, and he probably should be front and center at least as soon as you nominate him. And instead, Guo Taiming appears and kind of dominates the news coverage over the summer. And then in the fall, there's all of this discussion about Ho and Ke teaming up. And then after that falls apart, Ho has Zhao Xiaokong as his VP nominee. And Zhao Xiaokong is a very dominant personality, and he's out there kind of overshadowing Ho as well, right? And so it's just a little odd to have the who you think is the strongest candidate just kind of fade into the background for most of this campaign. And I say that in part because I think on paper Ho is still a pretty good candidate. If you look at the fact that he served in a DPP administration, if you think of the KMT as the smaller party here and the party that needs to reach across the aisle and attract independents and light green voters, well, the best way to do that if you're a KMT member is to nominate somebody who's Ban Shengren and worked for a DPP administration. And, he came up through the police ranks. The police are actually, according to most polls, the most popular institution in Taiwan. And so he had a lot of strengths, I thought, on paper. But he really, just given the performance in the campaign, I don't think performed as well as...
So what do you think about 2028? Who is going to represent KMT?
The obvious name is Jiang Wanhan because he's the mayor of Taipei. He's a relatively new face. He has the Jiang name, which is a double-edged sword. But it does help him with certain parts of the electorate. And Lu Xiuyan in Taichung is another, well-established mayor in a swing city, a big, important city, and has been fairly popular in that role. I think Jiang Wanhan his profile is probably a little bit more promising for the central government to be the president. One is he speaks decent English. He has some international experience, and Taipei is, as we know from many past elections, is a great springboard to the presidency. And so I think he's in a little better position. Also, let's address the elephant in the room. The KMT supporters are all old, right? They desperately need a candidate who can identify with anybody under 40, really under 50 probably. And so if they nominate somebody who's actually in that age cohort, that person at least has a chance of kind of breaking through and potentially attracting people who this time around voted overwhelmingly for Ke. So, the KMT's future, I don't think right now looks very bright, simply because so many of their supporters are old. So they probably need to do something they need somebody who can shake things up and kind of revamp their image.
I want to switch to the United States, from the United States point of view, okay? So let's start with this. So what do you think about how do they see Lai as a president?
Well, there's less familiarity with him than Tsai Ing-wen. Tsai has set a very high standard. It's inevitable when you get a new president coming in that there's a feeling out period where you adjust to the new personality and their preferences. I think it was helpful that Xiaobi Kim was his running mate, and that was done in part to try to win the election, but also in part because Xiaobi Kim has just a tremendous respect in Washington, and it, I think, was reassuring to see that her come back and be on the ticket, because there's an assumption in Washington that she may, she will be able to communicate very well with the Washington side and help smooth over any challenges in the relationship.
The State Department is going to send an unofficial delegation to Taiwan. So does this has any significance, you think?
Yeah, it's significant, but they do this after every election. So they did this in 2016 and in 2020. And it's always retired officials, so nobody who's in a current position. They're usually high-profile officials. So Stephen Hadley was Deputy National Security Advisor. James Steinberg, had an equally prominent role in the previous administration. So, and they're bipartisan. So they deliberately pick Republicans and Democrats. And so it's intended to communicate both publicly and privately what the U.S. interest in this election. And the symbolic part of this is that the U.S. policy towards Taiwan and towards the PRC remains unchanged, and we will continue to engage unofficially with the political leaders of Taiwan, no matter who wins the election, right? And so they would send this delegation. They would have sent it if Ho won. They would have sent it if Ko won. And in fact, the statement coming out of Washington, D.C. about this election would have been exactly the same no matter who won.
So, yeah, I believe so. But I mean, except the symbolic meaning of it, does it have any practical meaning of that?
I think so. They'll have a lot to talk about. I mean, Lai Ching-te has not been part of the inner circle of Tsai Ing-wen's government. He hasn't been deeply involved in conversations about security or intelligence sharing or defense reform. And because he is the incoming president, some of those conversations will have to happen now.
Okay. But, from where I stand right now, from the Taiwan's point of view, I would say that the election that matters more for the cross-strait relations is not actually the Taiwan's election. I actually think it's the election in United States
I agree.
This year.
Yeah.
I actually think that one matters even much more than this one. So we're talking about if Biden won, I think, it's just the policy will continue. I think it's more predictable. But how about Trump?
Yeah, well, so two things to say about that. One is Trump in his first term he actually appointed quite pro-Taiwan people to his cabinet, and their approach to China issues, they really executed a fundamental shift away from the previous consensus under both Republican and Democratic administrations that engagement would eventually lead to change in China. The Trump administration rejected that idea, and when Biden came into office, there was a surprising amount of continuity in China policy, and as a corollary in Taiwan policy, right? So the Trump administration in its last days actually lifted some of the contact guidelines or restrictions on contact with Taiwan, and basically loosened the one China policy. And the Biden administration, for the most part, has stuck with the changes that the Trump administration put in place. So it's plausible that if there were another Trump administration, that there actually wouldn't be a huge departure from the approach of the Biden administration, because that approach in turn came out of the Trump administration. The big difference is partners and allies. The Biden administration has put that front and center in their foreign policy, and so the approach to Taiwan is directly linked to the U.S.'s efforts to get Japan and Korea to talk to one another more closely, to so the kind of Indo-Pacific strategy of working with Australia. So what else? Five Eyes, the Quad, all of that is done implicitly with an eye towards building a big reliable coalition that could potentially intervene to help Taiwan.
好，那我们讲一下 take away 好了。
好的。
我先讲一下哈，我是真的觉得外媒把我们的候选人就是分成这种战争与和平选项这种二分法啊，非常要不得。
等等，我澄清一下，我觉得其实外媒有分啦，就是因为这次真的是很多家来，那其实这种有特派在台湾的，通常会搞得比较清楚。但如果不知道，他可能网络上搜资料，可能就会觉得说这个是战争跟和平，可以理解。但是我觉得这么做其实确实是像范姐讲的太简化了。
对，因为尤其是我觉得比如说有些人的解读就是说赖清德这次得票是40%左右嘛哈，那难道说60%就是这个
不同意他
就不同意他吗？就不同意民主吗？我觉得这个解读非常粗暴，
我有点像是分化的语言。
对，我觉得这是不合理的。OK， 那我觉得我们自己是台湾人，自己应该要能够分辨。OK， 这个说法是没有道理的。OK， 好。第二个呢，我要强调一点，就是说其实3个候选人的对外政策上面差别真的非常的小。我觉得这一次的选举，大家可以很明显的看得出来，台湾的最大的民意就是要维持现状。我不相信任何一个候选人选上，他能够偏离这个民意太远，
除非他不想要在下一个政权。
没错，然后讲到说维护民主这件事情，每个人都会这样讲说我一定是维护民主的，台湾的这个民主是大家的共识。但是我觉得最重要的是，还是要看他怎么样做。OK， 不能一边喊口号，但是另外一方面呢，比如说这个对选举的公平制度还不在乎 ，OK， 或者是说对政府的这个透明度他不在乎或者是说言论自由的这个管控的程度，我觉得应该是要更细项的去看所谓民主的一些比较重要的指标，看他们做的怎么样，这才是真正的所谓的维护民主。换你讲，
那其实可以看得出来，其实齐凯丽那时候讲了一个蛮有趣的东西，叫做他其实讲他觉得这台湾的选举有点无聊。那我觉得这个真的是只有在长期观察台湾选举的人才会得出的结论，甚至我觉得很多台湾人其实在投票前一天应该都心里还是蛮忐忑的，就不知道到底谁会赢。
我真的觉得蛮无聊的，因为我到那天早上的时候，我还觉得不管谁选上，我其实晚上都睡得着。
真的吗？
真的。
OK， 好。
你有谁选不上？有谁选上你会睡不着吗？
如果川普选上，我可能真的会睡不着。
OK， 那待会我们会谈谈川普了哈。
OK， 好。然后再来第二件事，其实就是听他讲话，其实真的可以感觉到，他作为一个学者，那其实他很小心讲话，其实跟王建教授一样，有些东西他有这个意见，但他不一定会全然保留出来。比方说，举个例子，那时候我们在讲这个中国的制裁政策，他一开始是说中国的弹药 ammunition， 但他想想很快就发现这个字好像不太对，他就说
他觉得太强烈了，
他觉得太
强烈了。
那所以他说换个方式，就是 tool in the toolbox， 就是工具箱里面的工具。那你就可以看出来，包含范姐问他这个川普当选的话，台湾会不会怎么样？那其实他应该心中是想说，川普要当选，要担心的是我们美国人吧？但他讲的非常的和缓，我觉得这一点就是很有趣，我蛮喜欢这种学者型的访谈。
他基本上是没有回答我的问题啦，真的，我就觉得他就直接回避掉了这个问题，他基本上没有回答了。可是他越没有回答，我就越吓这样子。OK， 我真的越担心，因为《经济学人》才登了一篇文章啦，那他就在讲说，现在看起来川普在年底的选举很有可能会回笼啊，所以现在各国的皮唰 OK， 然后呢，其中他还特别提到了，就是说如果川普回来的话，台湾、乌克兰有可能会被川普抛弃。然后这个他里面还提到说，甚至做了分析说，如果川普真的放弃了台湾防卫的话，会对美国造成什么影响这样子。OK， 所以其实这个今年年底的这个选举，我是真的觉得它的重要度会比我们这一次的选举更为重要。我们最重要是要看台湾的赖清德跟美国的总统，不管是谁选上，是跟川普配或跟拜登的这个组合的时候，对美中台的这个关系会产生什么样的变化。OK， 所以这个我觉得其实会跟之前可能会蛮不一样的。
所以我觉得啦，就是当然美国选怎么样总统那是别人的内政，我们身为我们不喜欢干预他国内政，但是我觉得其实我们能够做的就是督促好我们现在的政府。那没有办法靠别人的时候，你国防如果自己要准备好，你要怎么样在经济上更加的嵌入这个国际的这个供应链体系里面，彰显自己的重要性，那或是甚至是你国防上或是这个民防上要怎么样准备，我觉得这东西才是我们，如果你真的很在乎自由跟民主，我觉得这是我们要不断督促政府，就是你 做的够不够？
对，然后这次3个候选人，我觉得基本上来讲就从我们的访谈过程里面啦他们都说他们是亲美的嘛。
不管说有没有亲美，但一定要把亲美放在里面。
对，就是我觉得基本上就是亲美的啦然后呢，可是问题是，如果这次川普选上来的话亲美这条路线，我不知道会产生什么样的变化 ，I don't know 那主要是呢，《纽约时报》最近也看了一篇文章，那他引用的这个数据是一个中研院所做的民调。那中研院做这个民调呢，主要就是在问台湾人说，你对于美国人守信这件事情有多少信心？然后这个数字在2021年的时候做呢，那时候是9合1的选举之前嘛，他们做了一次这样。那时候的这个对台湾人对美国守信这件事的信心，那时候还有45%。那这一次选前再做了一次同样的民调，已经掉到了只有34%。所以其实台湾人对于美国是不是守信这件事情，他这个信心正在下降当中。好，那所以说因为美国这个年底的选举，我想影响非常的大，所以我们其实有在考虑也许我们到时候会派人过去真的我们也到美国去观选。好了，那今天对于齐凯丽所讲的或我们2个人所讲，大家有什么想法的话，非常欢迎留言告诉我们。那如果对喜欢我们的频道的话，应该要
按赞、订阅、分享、donate。
谢谢大家。